Chapter 30 of Square Deal Sanderson by Charles Alden Seltzer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Law Takes a Hand. Barney Owen was tying the knot of the rope more securely when he heard the bolt on the pantry door shoot back. He wheeled swiftly to see Mary Bransford emerging from the pantry, her hands covering her face in a vain endeavor to shut from sight the grisly horror she had confronted when she had reached her feet after recovering consciousness. Evidently she had no knowledge of what had occurred, for when, at a sound Owen made, and she uncovered her eyes, she saw Owen and instantly fainted. Owen dove forward and caught her as she fell, and then, with a strength that was remarkable in his frail body, he carried her to the lounge in the parlor. He was compelled to leave her there momentarily, for he still entertained fears that Dale would escape the loop of the rope. So he ran into the pantry, looked keenly at Dale, saw that, to all appearances, he was in the last stages of strangulation, and then went out again to return to Mary. But before he left Dale, he snatched the man's six-shooter from its sheath, for his own had been lost in the confusion of the rush of Dale's men for the door. Mary was sitting up on the lounge when Owen returned. She was pale, and a haunting fear, cringing, abject, was in her eyes. She got to her feet when she saw Owen and ran to him, crying. Owen tried to comfort her, but his words were futile. "You be brave, little woman," he said. "You must be brave. Sanderson and the other men are in danger, and I got to go to Okar for help." "I'll go with you," declared the girl. "I can't stay here. I won't. I can't stand being in the same house with that." She pointed to the kitchen. "All right," Owen said resignedly. "We'll both go. What did you do with the money?" Mary disclosed the hiding place, and Owen took the money, carried it to the bunkhouse, where he stuffed it into the bottom of a tin food box. Then, hurriedly, he saddled and bridled two horses and led them to where Mary was waiting on the porch. Mounting, they rode fast toward Okar, the little man's face working nervously, a great eagerness in his heart to help the man for whom he had conceived a deep affection. Banker Mason had made no mistake when he had told Sanderson that Judge Graney was honest. Graney looked honest. There was about him an atmosphere of straightforwardness that was unmistakable and convincing. It was because he was honest that a certain governor had sent him to Okar, and Graney had vindicated the governor's faith in him. Whenever crime and dishonesty raised their heads in Okar, Judge Graney pinned them to the wall with the sword of justice and called upon all men to come and look upon his deeds. Mason, Silverthorne, and Dale, and others of their ilk, seldom called upon the judge for advice. They knew he did not deal in their kind. Through some underground channel, they had secured a deputyship for Dale, and upon him they depended for whatever law they needed to further their schemes. Judge Graney was 50, the age of experience. He knew something of men himself, and on the night that Mason and Sanderson had come to him, he thought he had seen in Sanderson's eyes a cold menace, a threat, that meant nothing less than death for the banker if the latter had refused to write the bill of sale. For, of course, the judge knew that the banker was being forced to make out the bill of sale. He knew that from the cold determination and alert watchfulness in Sanderson's eyes. He saw it in the white nervousness of the banker. And yet it was not his business to interfere or to refuse to attest the signatures of the men. He had asked Mason to take the oath, and the banker had taken it. Thus, it seemed he had entered into the contract in good faith. If he had not, and there was something wrong about the deal, Mason had recourse to the law, and the judge would have aided him. But nothing had come of it. Mason had said nothing, had lodged no complaint, but the judge had kept the case in mind. Late in the afternoon of the day in which Dale had organized the posse to go to the AA, Judge Graney sat at his desk in the courtroom. The room was empty, except for a court attaché, who was industriously writing at a little desk in the rear of the room. The Mason case was in the judge's mental vision, and he was wondering why the banker had not complained when the sheriff of Colfax entered. Graney smiled a welcome at him. "You don't get over this way very often, Ward, but when you do, I'm glad to see you. Sit on the desk. That's your usual place anyway." Ward followed the suggestion about the desk. He sat on it, his legs dangling. There was a glint of doubt and anxiety in his eyes. "What's wrong, Ward?" asked the judge. "Plenty," declared Ward. "I've come to you for advice, and perhaps for some warrants. You recollect some time ago there was a herd of cattle lost in Devil's Hole, and some men. Some of the men were shot, and one or two of them went down under the herd when it stampeded." "Yes," said the judge. "I heard rumors of it, but those things are not uncommon, and I haven't time to look them up unless the cases are brought formally to my attention." "Well," resumed Ward, "at the time there didn't seem to be any clue to work on that would indicate who had done the killing. We've nothing to do with the stampede, of course. That sort of stuff is out of my line. But about the shooting of the men, I got evidence now." "Go ahead," directed the judge. "Well, on the night of the killing, two of my men were nosing around the level near Devil's Hole, trying to locate a horse thief who had been trailed to that section. They didn't find the horse thief, but they saw a bunch of men sneaking around a campfire that belonged to the outfit which was trailing the herd that went down in Devil's Hole. They didn't interfere, 'cause they didn't know what was up, but they saw one of the men stampede the herd, and they saw the rest of 'em do the killing." "Who did the killing?" "Dale and his gang," declared the sheriff. Judge Graney's eyes glowed. He sat erect and looked hard at the sheriff. "Who is Sanderson?" he asked. "That's the fellow who bossed the trail herd." The judge smiled oddly. "There were 3,000 head of cattle?" Ward straightened. "How in hell do you know?" he demanded. "Banker Mason paid for them," he said gently. He related to Ward the incident of the visit of Sanderson and the banker, and the payment to Sanderson by Mason of the $90,000. At the conclusion of the recital, Ward struck the desk with his fist. "Damned if I didn't think it was something like that," he declared. "But I wasn't going to make a holler until I was sure. But Sanderson knew, eh? He knew all the time who had done the killing and who had planned it. Game, eh? He was playing her a lone hand." The sheriff was silent for a moment, and then he spoke again, a glow of excitement in his eyes. "But there'll be hell to pay about this. If Sanderson took $90,000 away from Mason, Mason was sure to tell Dale and Silverthorne about it, for they're as thick as three in a bed, and none of them are the kind of men to stand for that kind of stuff from anybody, not even from a man like Sanderson. We got to do something, Judge. Give me warrants for the three of them, Dale, Mason, and Silverthorne, and I'll run them in before they get a chance to hand Sanderson anything." Judge Graney called the busy clerk and gave him brief instructions. As the latter started toward his desk, there was a sound at the door, and Barney Owen came in, breathing heavily. Barney's eyes lighted when they rested upon the sheriff, for he had not hoped to see him there. He related to them what had happened at the AA that day, and how Dale's men had followed Sanderson and the others to wipe them out if they could. "That settles it," declared the sheriff. He was outside in an instant, running here and there in search of men to form a posse. He found them, scores of them, for in all communities where the law is represented, there are men who take pride in upholding it. So it was with Okar. When the law-loving citizens of the town were told what had occurred, they began to gather around the sheriff from all directions, all armed and eager. And yet it was long after dusk before the cavalcade of men turned their horses' heads toward the neck of the basin, to begin the long, hard ride over the plains to the spot where Sanderson, Williams, and the others had been ambushed by Dale's men. A rumor came to the men, however, just before they started, which made several of them look at one another. For there had been those who had seen Ben Nyland riding down the street toward Mason's Bank in the dusk, his face set and grim, and a wild light in his eyes. "Mason has been guzzled. He's deader than a salt mackerel," came the word, leaping from lip to lip. Sheriff Ward grinned. "Serves him right," he declared. "That's one less for us to hang." End of chapter 30. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 31 of Square Deal Sanderson by Charles Alden Seltzer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fugitive. After the departure of Barney Owen and Mary Bransford, the AA ranch house was as silent as any house, supposed to be occupied by a dead man, could be. But after a few minutes, if one had looked over the top of the partition from which Owen had hanged Alva Dale, one might have seen Dale move a little. One might have been frightened, but if one had stayed there, it would have been to see Dale move again. The first time he moved, he had merely placed his feet upon the floor to rest himself. The second movement resulted in him raising his smashed hands and lifting the noose from his neck. He threw it viciously from him after removing it, so that it flew over the top of the partition and swished sinuously upon the floor of the kitchen. For Barney Owen had not done a good job in hanging Dale. For when Barney had run across the kitchen with the rope to tie it to the fastenings of the door, it had slacked a little, enough to permit Dale's toes to touch the floor of the pantry. Feeling the slack, Dale had taken advantage of it, throwing his head forward a little to keep the rope taut while Owen fastened it. All that had been involuntary with Dale. For, at that time, Dale had no thought of trying to fool Owen. He had merely taken what chance had given him. And when the first shock of the thing was over, he had begun his attempts to reach the top of the partition in order to slacken the rope enough to get it over his head, for at that time he did not know that already the rope was slack enough. It was not until after his hands had been smashed and he had dropped to the floor again that he realized that he might have thrown the rope off at once. Then it was too late for him to do anything, for he felt Owen above him at the top of the partition, and he thought Owen had a gun. So he feigned strangulation, and Owen had been deceived. And when Owen had entered the pantry, Dale still continued to feign strangulation, letting his body sag, and causing a real pressure on his neck. He dared not open his eyes to see if Owen had a weapon, For then the little man, having a gun, would have quickly finished the work that seemingly the rope had begun. Dale might have drawn his own gun, taking a long chance of hitting Owen, but he was at a great disadvantage because of the condition of his hands, and he decided not to. Dale heard Owen and Mary go out. He heard the clatter of hoofs as they rode away. Then he emerged from the pantry and through a window watched the two as they rode down the slope of the basin. Then Dale yielded to the bitter disappointment that oppressed him, and cursed profanely, going from room to room and vengefully kicking things out of his way while bandaging his smashed hands. In the parlor he overturned the lounge and almost kicked it to pieces, searching for the money Mary had told him was concealed there. "The damn hussy!" he raged, when he realized the money was not in the lounge. He went out, got on his horse, and rode across the level back of the house and up the slope leading to the mesa, where he had seen Sanderson riding earlier in the day. For an hour he rode, warily, for he did not want to come upon Sanderson unawares if his men had not intercepted his enemy, and then reaching the edge of the section of hilly country, he halted and sat motionless in the saddle. For from some distance ahead of him he heard the reports of firearms, and over him at the sound swept a curious reluctance to go any further in that direction. For it seemed to him there was something forbidding in the sound. It was as though the sounds carried to him on the slight breeze were burdened with an evil portent, that they carried a threat and a warning. He sat long there, undecided, vacillating. Then he shuddered, wheeled his horse, and sent him scampering over the back trail. He rode to the Bar D. His men, the regular punchers, were working far down in the basin, and there was no one in the house. He sat for hours alone in his office, waiting for news of the men he had sent after Sanderson. And as the interval of their absence grew longer, the dark forebodings that had assailed him when within hearing distance of the firing seized him again, grew more depressing, and he sat, gripping the arms of his chair, a clammy perspiration stealing over him. He shook off the feeling at last and stood up, scowling. "That's what a man gets for giving up to a damn fool notion like that," he said, thinking of the fear that had seized him while listening to the shooting. "Once a man lets on he's afraid, the thing keeps a working on him till he's certain sure he's a coward. Them boys didn't need me anyway. They'll get Sanderson." So he justified his lack of courage, and spent some hours reading. But at last the strain grew too great, and as the dusk came on, he began to have thoughts of Dal Colton. Ben Nilan must have reached home by this time. Had Colton succeeded? He thought of riding to Nilan's ranch, but he gave up that idea when he reasoned that perhaps Colton had failed, and in that case Nilan wouldn't be the most gentle person in the world to face on his own property. If Colton had succeeded, he would find him in Okar. So he mounted his horse and rode to Okar. The town seemed to be deserted when he dismounted in front of the city hotel. He did not go inside the building, merely looking in through one of the windows and seeing a few men in there playing cards in a listless manner. He did not see Colton. He looked into several other windows. Colton was nowhere to be seen. In several places Dale inquired about him. No one had seen Colton that day. No one said anything to Dale about what had happened. Perhaps they thought he knew. At any rate, Dale heard no word of what had transpired during his absence. Men spoke to him, or nodded, and looked away, to look at him when his back was turned. All this had its effect on Dale. He noted the restraint. He felt the atmosphere of strangeness. But he blamed it all on the queer premonition that had taken possession of his senses. It was not Okar that looked strange, nor the men. It was himself. He went to the bank building and entered the rear door, clumping heavily up the stairs, for he felt a heavy depression. When he opened the door at the top of the stairs, night had come. A kerosene lamp on a table in the room blinded him for an instant, and he stood blinking at it. When his eyes grew accustomed to the glare, he saw Peggy Nyland sitting up in bed, looking at him. She did not say anything, but continued to look at him. There was wonder in her eyes, and Dale saw it. It was wonder over Dale's visit, over his coming to Okar. Ben must have missed him, for Dale was alive. Dale could not have heard what had happened. "You're better, eh?" said Dale. She merely nodded her reply and watched Dale as he crossed the room. Reaching a door that led into another room, Dale turned. "Where's Mason?" Peggy pointed at the door on whose threshold Dale stood. Dale entered. What he saw in the room caused him to come out again, his face ashen. "What's happened?" he demanded hoarsely, stepping to the side of the bed and looking down at Peggy. Peggy told him. The man's face grew gray with the great fear that clutched him, and he stepped back, then came forward again, looking keenly at the girl, as though he doubted her. "Nyland killed him? Choked him to death?" he said. Peggy nodded silently. The cringing fear showed in the man's eyes appalled her. She hated him, and he had done this thing to her, but she did not want the stigma of another killing on her brother's name. "Look here, Dale," she said. "You'd better get out of here, and out of the country. Okar is all stirred up over what you have done. Sheriff Ward was in Okar, and he had a talk with Judge Graney. Ward knows who killed those men at Devil's Hole, and he's going to hang them. You are one of them, but you won't hang if Ben catches you. And he is looking for you. You'd better go, and go fast." For an instant Dale stood looking at Peggy, searching her face and probing her eyes for signs that she was lying to him. He saw no such signs. Turning swiftly, he ran down the stairs, out into the street, and mounting, with his horse already running, he fled toward the basin and the Bar D. He had yielded entirely to the presentiment of evil that had tortured him all day. All his schemes and plots for the stealing of the AA and Nyland's ranch were forgotten in the frenzy to escape that had taken possession of him, and he spurred his horse to its best efforts as he ran away from Okar, as he fled from the vengeance of those forces which his evilness had aroused. End of chapter 31. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 32 of Square Deal Sanderson by Charles Alden Seltzer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Winning a fight. After Sanderson shot the big man who had tried to rush him, there was a silence in the defile. Those of Dale's men who had positions of security held them, not exposing themselves to the deadly fire of Sanderson and the others. For 2 hours Sanderson clung to his precarious position in the fissure, until his muscles ached with the strain and his eyes blurred because of the constant vigil. But he grimly held the place, knowing that upon him depended in a large measure the safety of the men on the opposite side of the defile. The 3rd hour was beginning when Sanderson saw a puff of smoke burst from behind a rock held by one of his men. He heard the crash of a pistol, and saw one of Dale's men flop into view from behind a rock near him. Sanderson's smile was a tribute to the vigilance of his men. Evidently the Dale man, fearing Sanderson's inaction might mean he was seeking a new position from where he could pick off more of his enemies, had shifted his own position so no part of his body was exposed to Sanderson. He had wriggled around too far, and the shot from Sanderson's man had been the result. The man was not dead. Sanderson could see him writhing. He was badly wounded, too, and Sanderson did not shoot, though he could have finished him. But the incident drew Sanderson's attention to the possibilities of a new position. He had thought at first that he had climbed as high in the fissure as he dared, without exposing himself to the fire of the Dale men. But, examining the place again, he saw that he might, with exceeding caution, take another position about 20 feet further on. He decided to try, letting himself down until his feet struck a flat rock projection. He rested. Then, the weariness dispersed, he began to climb, shoving his rifle between his body and the cartridge belt around his waist. It took him half an hour to reach the point he had decided upon, and by that time the sun had gone far down into the hazy western distance, and a glow, saffron and rose and violet, like a gauze curtain slowly descending, warned him that twilight was not far away. Sanderson determined to finish the battle before the darkness could come to increase the hazard, and when he reached the spot in the fissure he hurriedly took note of the strategic points of the position. There was not much concealment for his body. He was compelled to lie flat on his stomach to be certain that no portion of his body was exposed, and he found a place in a little depression at the edge of the fissure that seemed suitable. Then he raised his head above the little ridge that concealed him from his enemies. He saw them all, every man of them. Some of them were crouching, some were lying prone, apparently resting. Still others were sitting, their backs against their protection, waiting. Sanderson took his rifle by the barrel, and with the stock forced a channel through some rotted rock on the top of the little ridge that afforded him concealment. When he had dug the channel deeply enough so that he could aim the weapon without exposing his head, he stuck the rifle barrel into the channel and shouted to the Dale men, "This game is played out, boys. I'm behind you. You can't hide any longer. I give you fair warning that if you don't come out within a minute, throwing your guns away and holding up your hands, I'll pick you off one by one. That goes." There was sincerity in Sanderson's voice, but the men doubted. Sanderson saw them look around, but it was plain to him that they could not tell from which direction his voice came. "Bluffing," scoffed a man who was in plain view of Sanderson, the very man, indeed, upon whom Sanderson had his rifle trained. "Bluffing, eh?" replied Sanderson grimly. "I've got a bead on you. At the end of 1 minute, if you don't toss your guns away and step out, holding up your hands, I'll bore you. Plenty." Half a minute passed and the man did not move. He was crouching, and his gaze swept the edge of the fissure from which Sanderson's voice seemed to come. His face was white, his eyes wide with the fear of death. Just when it seemed that Sanderson must shoot to make his statement and threat convincing, the man shouted, "This game's too certain for me. I'm through." He threw his weapons away so that they went bounding and clattering to the foot of the slope. Then he again faced the fissure, shouting, "I know I've caved, and you know I've caved. But what about them guys on the other side there? They'll be blowing me apart if I go to showing myself." Sanderson called to Williams and the others, telling them the men were going to surrender and warning them to look out for treachery. "If one of them tries any monkey shines, nail him," he ordered. "There's 11 of 'em that ain't been touched, and some more that ain't as active as they might be. But they can bend a gun handy enough. Don't take any chances." Sanderson ordered the man to step out. He did so gingerly, as though he expected to be shot. When he was in plain view of Sanderson's men, Sanderson ordered him to descend the slope and stand beside a huge rock ledge. He watched while the man descended. Then he called to the others, "Step up and take your medicine. One at a time. Guns first. Williams," he called, "you get their guns as fast as they come down. I'll see that none of 'em plug you while you're doing it." There was no hitch in the surrender, and no attempt to shoot Williams. One by one, the men dropped their weapons down the slope. When all the men had reached the bottom of the defile, Sanderson climbed down and asked the first man who had surrendered where they had left their horses. The animals were brought, and the men forced to mount them. Then, the Dale men riding ahead, Sanderson and the others behind, they began the return trip. When they reached the open country above the defile, Sanderson rode close to Williams. "There's enough of you to take care of this gang," he said, indicating the prisoners. "I'm going to hit the breeze to the AA and see what's happening there." "Sure," agreed Williams. "Beat it." When Street got the word, he leaped forward at a pace that gave Williams an idea of how he had gained his name. He flashed by the head of the moving columns and vanished into the growing darkness, running with long, swift, sure leaps that took him over the ground like a feather before a hurricane. But fast as he went, he did not travel too rapidly for Sanderson. For in Sanderson's heart also lurked a premonition of evil. But he did not fear it. It grimmed his lips. It made his eyes blaze with a wanton, savage fire. It filled his heart with a bitter passion to slay the man who had stayed behind at the AA ranch house. And he urged Streak to additional effort, heading him recklessly through sections of country where a stumble meant disaster, lifting him on the levels, and riding all the time with only one thought in mind: speed, speed, speed. End of chapter 32. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 33 of Square Deal Sanderson by Charles Alden Seltzer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Man Leaves Okar. Riding the hard trail through the basin, from its neck at Okar to the broad upward slope that led to the AA ranch house, came another man, who also was sacrificing everything to speed. His horse was fresh, and he spared it not at all as he swept in long, smooth, swift undulations over the floor of the basin. Ben Nyland's lips were as straight and hard as were those of the other man who was racing toward the AA from another direction. His face was as grim and his thoughts were as bitter and savage. When he reached the bottom of the long, gentle slope that stretched to the AA ranch house, he did not spare his horse. The terrible spurs sank in again and again, stirring the animal to a frenzy of effort, and he rushed up the slope as though it were a level, snorting with pain and fury, but holding the pace his rider demanded of him. And when he reached the corral fence near the AA ranch house, and his rider dismounted and ran forward, the horse heaved a sigh of relief and stood, bracing his legs to keep from falling, his breath coming in terrific heaves. An instant after his arrival, Ben Nyland was inside the AA ranch house, pistol in hand. He tore through the rooms in the darkness, stumbling over the furniture, knocking it hither and there as it interfered with his progress. He found no one. Accidentally colliding with a table in the kitchen, he searched its top and discovered thereon a kerosene lamp. Lighting it with fingers that trembled, he looked around him. There were signs of the confusion that had reigned during the day. He saw on the floor the rope that had encircled Dale's neck. One end of it was tied to the fastening of the kitchen door. The tied rope was a mystery to Nyland, but it suggested hanging to his thoughts, already lurid, and he leaped for the pantry. There he grimly viewed the wreck and turned away, muttering. "He's been here and gone," he said, meaning Dale. "Them's his marks. Ruin." Blowing out the light, he went to the front door, paused in it, and then went out upon the porch, from where he could look northeastward at the edge of the mesa surmounting the big slope that merged into the floor of the basin. Faintly outlined against the luminous dark blue of the sky, he caught the leaping silhouette of a horse and rider. He grinned coldly and stepped back into the shadow of the doorway. "That's him, damn him," he said. "He's coming back." He had not long to wait. He saw the leaping silhouette disappear, seeming to sink into the earth, but he knew that horse and rider were descending the slope, that it would not be long before they would thunder up to the ranch house, and he gripped the butt of his gun until his fingers ached. He saw a blot appear from the dark shadows of the slope and come rushing toward him. He could hear the heave and sob of the horse's breath as it ran, and in another instant the animal came to a sliding halt near the edge of the porch. The rider threw himself out of the saddle and ran forward. At the first step taken by the man after he reached the porch edge, he was halted by Nyland's sharp, "Hands up!" and at the sound of the other's voice the newcomer cried out in astonishment. "Ben Nyland! What in hell are you doing here?" "Looking for Dale," said the other hoarsely. "Thought you was him, and come pretty near boring you. What saved you was a notion I had of wanting Dale to know what I was killing him for. Pretty close deal. Why do you want to kill him?" "For what he done to Peggy, damn him. He sneaked into the house and hurt her head, dragging her to Okar, to Mason's. I killed Mason, and I'll kill him." "He ain't here, then? Dale ain't?" demanded Sanderson. "They ain't nobody here," gruffly answered Nyland. "They been here and gone. Dale, most likely. The house looks like a twister had struck it." Sanderson was inside before Nyland ceased speaking. He found the lamp, lit it, and looked around the interior, noting the partially destroyed lounge and the other wrecked furniture strewn around the rooms. He went out again and met Nyland on the porch. One look at Sanderson told Nyland what was in the latter's mind, and he said, "He's at the Bar D, most likely. We'll get him." "I ain't taking no chance of missing him," Sanderson shot back at Nyland as they mounted their horses. "You fan it to Okar, and I'll head for his shack." Nyland's agreement to this plan was manifested by his actions. He said nothing, but rode beside Sanderson for a mile or so. Then he veered off and rode at an angle which would take him to the neck of the basin, while Sanderson, turning slightly northward, headed streak for Dale's ranch. Halfway between the AA and the neck of the basin, Nyland came upon the sheriff and his posse. The posse halted Nyland, thinking he might be Dale, but upon discovering the error allowed the man to proceed. after he had told them that Sanderson was safe and was riding toward the Bar D. Sanderson, Nyland said, was after Dale. He did not say that he, too, wanted to see Dale. "Dale?" mocked the sheriff. "Barney Owen hung him. Dale's alive and in Okar, or somewhere," Nyland flung back at them as he raced toward town. "I reckon we might as well go back," said the sheriff to his men. "The cleanup has took place, and it's all over, or Sanderson wouldn't be back. We'll go back to Okar and have a talk with Silverthorne. And maybe, if Dale's around, we'll run into him." The posse, led by the sheriff, returned to Okar. Within 5 minutes after his arrival in town, the sheriff was confronting Silverthorne in the latter's office in the railroad station. The posse waited. "It comes to this, Silverthorne," said the sheriff. "We ain't got any evidence that you had a hand in killing those men at Devil's Hole. But there ain't a man, an honest man, in town that ain't convinced that you did have a hand in it. What I want to say to you is this. Sanderson and Nyland are running Maverick around the country tonight. Nyland has killed Mason and is hunting for Dale. Sanderson and his men have cleaned up the bunch of guys that went out this morning to wipe Sanderson out, and Sanderson is looking for Dale. And after he gets Dale, he'll come for you, for he's seeing red for sure. I ain't interfering. This is one of those times when the law don't see anything, and don't want to see anything. I won't touch Nyland for killing Mason, and I won't lay a finger on Sanderson if he shoots the gizzard out of you. There's a train out of here in 15 minutes. I give you your chance. Take the train or take your chance with Sanderson." "I'll take the train," declared Silverthorne. 15 minutes later, white and scared, he was sitting in a coach, cringing far back into one of the seats, cursing, for it seemed to him that the train would never start. End of chapter 33. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 34 of Square Deal Sanderson by Charles Alden Seltzer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A man gets a square deal. Dale did not miss Ben Nyland by more than a few hundred yards as he passed through the neck of the basin, but the men could not see each other in the black shadows cast by the somber mountains that guarded the entrance to the basin, and so they sped on, one headed away from Okar and one toward it, each man nursing his bitter thoughts, one intent on killing and the other riding to escape the death that, he felt, was imminent. Dale reached the Bar D and pulled the saddle and bridle from his horse. He caught up a fresh animal, threw saddle and bridle on him, and then ran into the house to get some things that he thought might be valuable to him. He came out again and nervously paused on the threshold of the door to listen. A sound reached his ears, the heavy drumming of a horse's hoofs on the hard sand in the vicinity of the ranch house, and Dale gulped down his fear as he ran to his horse, threw himself into the saddle, and raced around a corner of the house. He had hardly vanished into the gloom of the night when another rider burst into view. The second rider was Sanderson. He did not halt Streak at the door of the Bar D ranch house, for from a distance he had seen a man throw himself upon a horse and dash away, and he knew of no man in the basin except Dale who would find it necessary to run from his home in that fashion. So he kept Streak in the dead run he had been in when approaching the house, and when he reached the corner around which Dale had vanished, he saw his man, 200 or 300 yards ahead, flashing across a level toward the far side of the big basin. He knew that Dale thought his pursuer was Nyland, and that thought gave Sanderson a grim joy. In Sanderson's mind was a picture of Dale's face, of the stark, naked astonishment that would be on it when he discovered that it was Sanderson and not Nyland who had caught him. For Sanderson would catch him. He was convinced of that. The conviction became strengthened when, after half an hour's run, Streak had pulled up on Dale. Sanderson could see that Dale's horse was running erratically, that it faltered on the slight rises that they came to now and then. And when Sanderson discovered that Dale's horse was failing, he urged Streak to a faster pace. In an hour, the space between the two riders had become less. They were climbing the long, gradual slope that led upward out of the basin when Dale's horse stumbled and fell, throwing Dale out of the saddle. There was something horribly final in the manner of Dale's falling, for he tumbled heavily and lay perfectly quiet afterward. His horse, after rising, stumbled on a few steps and fell again. Sanderson, fully alive to the danger of haste, rode slowly toward the fallen man. He was taking no chances, for Dale might be shamming in an effort to shoot Sanderson as he came forward. But Dale was not shamming. Dismounting and drawing his pistol, Sanderson went forward. Dale did not move, and when at last Sanderson stood over the fallen man, he saw that his eyes were closed and that a great gash had been cut in his forehead near the right temple. Sanderson saw that the man was badly hurt, but to make sure of him, he drew Dale's pistol from its sheath and searched his clothing for other weapons, finding another pistol in a pocket and a knife in a belt. These he threw into some brush nearby, and then he bent over the man. Dale was unconscious, and despite all Sanderson could do, he remained so. Sanderson examined the wound in his temple and discovered that it was deep and ragged, such a wound as a jagged stone might make. It was midnight when Sanderson ceased his efforts and decided that Dale would die. He pitied the man, but he felt no pang of regret, for Dale had brought his death upon himself. Sanderson wondered, standing there, looking down at Dale, whether he would have killed the man. He decided that he would have killed him. "But that ain't no reason why I should let him die after he's had an accident," he told himself. "I'll get him to Okar, to the doctor. Then, after the doc patches him up, if he can, and I still think he needs killing, I'll do it." So he brought Dale's horse nearer. The animal had had a long rest and had regained his strength. Sanderson bent to Dale and lifted his shoulders so that he might get an arm under him to carry him to his horse. But at the first movement Dale groaned and opened his eyes, looking directly into Sanderson's. "Don't!" he said. "For God's sake, don't! You'll break me apart. It's my back. It's broke. I felt you working around me for hours, but it won't do any good. I'm done. I can feel myself going." Sanderson laid him down again and knelt beside him. "You're Sanderson," said Dale after a time. "I thought it was Nyland chasing me for a while. Then I heard you talking to your horse, and I knew it was you. Why don't you kill me?" "I reckon the Lord is doing that," said Sanderson. "Yes, he is. Well, the Lord ain't ever done anything for me." He was silent for a moment. Then, "I want to tell you something, Sanderson. I've tried to hate you, but I ain't never succeeded. I've admired you. I've cussed myself for doing it, but I couldn't help it. And because I couldn't hate you, I tried my best to do things that would make you hate me. I've deviled Mary Bransford because I thought it would stir you up. I don't care anything for her. It's Peggy Nyland that I like. Maybe I'd have done the square thing to her if I'd been let alone, and if she'd have liked me. Peggy's better, ain't she? When I saw her after I saw Mason laying there, choked to... So you saw Mason dead, you say? Ben Nyland guzzled him. Dale's lips wreathed in a cynical smile. Ben thought Mason had brought Peggy to his rooms. You knowed Mason was dead? Sanderson nodded. Then you must have been to Okar, he groaned. Where's Ben Nyland? In Okar. He's looking for you. Sanderson leaned closer to the man and spoke sharply to him. Look here, Dale. You were at the AA. What has become of Mary Bransford? She went away with Barney Owen to Okar. Nobody hurt her, he said as he saw Sanderson's eyes glow. She's all right. She's with her brother. He saw Sanderson's eyes. They were filled with an expression of incredulity, and a late moon, just showing its rim above the edge of the mesa above them, flooded the slope with a brilliancy that made it possible for Dale to see another expression in Sanderson's eyes, an expression which told him that Sanderson thought his mind was wandering. He laughed weakly. You think I'm loco, eh? Well, I ain't. Barney Owen ain't Barney Owen at all. He's Will Bransford. I found that out yesterday, he continued soberly as Sanderson looked quickly at him. I had some men down to Tombstone way looking him up. When old Bransford showed me the letter that you took away from me, I knew Will Bransford was in Tombstone. And when Mary sent that 1,000 to him, I set a friend of mine, Gary Miller, on to him. Gary and two of his friends salivated young Bransford, but he turned up later, minus the money, in Tombstone. Another friend of mine sent me word, and a description of him. Barney Owen is Bransford. Just what happened to Gary Miller and his two friends has bothered me a heap, went on Dale. They was to come this way to help me in this deal, but they never showed up. Sanderson smiled, and Dale's eyes gleamed. You know what's become of him? He charged. That's where you got that 1,000 you gave to Mary Bransford. And the papers showing that young Bransford was due here, ain't it? I ain't saying, says Sanderson. Well, declared Dale, Barney Owen is Will Bransford. The night Morley got him drunk, we went the limit with Owen, and he talked enough to make me suspicious. That's why I sent to Tombstone to find out how he looked. We had the evidence to show the court at Las Vegas. We was going to prove you wasn't young Bransford, and then we was going to put Owen out of the... Dale gasped, caught his breath, and stiffened. Sanderson stayed with him until the dawn, sitting quietly beside him until the end. Then Sanderson got up, threw the body on Dale's horse, mounted his own, and set out across the basin toward Okar. End of chapter 34. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 35 of Square Deal Sanderson by Charles Alden Seltzer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Deal in Love. A few days later, Mary Bransford, Sanderson, and Barney Owen were sitting on the porch of the AA ranch house near where they had sat on the day Mary and Owen and the Dale men had seen Sanderson riding along the edge of the mesa in his pursuit of Williams and the others. Mary and Sanderson were sitting rather close together at one end of the porch. Barney Owen was sitting near them on the porch edge, his elbows resting on his knees. There had been a silence between the three for some time, but at last Sanderson broke it. He smiled at Mary. "We'll build that dam and the irrigation plant now, maybe," he said. "But it's going to be a big job. William says it will take a year or more." "There will be difficulties, too, I suppose," said Mary. "Sure. But difficulties do not worry you," she went on, giving him a glowing look. He blushed. "We promised each other not to refer to that again," he protested. "You are breaking your promise." "I just can't help it," she declared. "I feel so good over your victory. Why, it really wasn't your affair at all, and yet you came here, fought our fight for us, and then, when it was all over, you wish us to say nothing about it. That isn't fair." He grinned. "Was you fair?" he charged. "You told me the other day that you knew, the day after I ordered Dale away from the AA, after telling you that I wasn't what I claimed to be, that Barney Owen wasn't Barney Owen at all, but your brother. And you let me go on, not telling me. And he didn't do a heap of talking. I ain't mentioned it till now, but I've wondered why. Barney knew from the first day that I wasn't what I pretended to be. Why didn't you tell me, Barney?" Mary was blushing, and Barney's face was red. His eyes met Mary's, and both pairs were lowered guiltily. Barney turned to Sanderson. "Look at me," he said. "Do I look like a man who could fight Dale, Silverthorne, and Mason, and the gang they had, with any hope of victory? When I got here, after escaping Gary Miller and the others, I was all in, sick and weak. It didn't take me long to see how things were, but I knew I couldn't do anything. I was waiting, though, for Gary Miller and his friends to come to claim the AA. I would have killed them, but they didn't come. You came. At first I was not sure what to think of you, but I saw sympathy in your eyes when you looked at Mary, and when you told Dale that you were Will Bransford, I decided to keep silent. You looked capable, and when I saw that you were willing to fight for Mary, why, I just let you go. I was afraid that if I'd tell you who I was, you'd throw up the whole deal, and so I didn't say anything." Sanderson grinned. "That's the reason you was so willing to sign all the papers that wanted Will Bransford's signature. I sure was a boxhead for not tumbling to that." He laughed, meeting Mary's gaze and holding it. "Talking of throwing up the deal," he said, "that couldn't be. Dale and Silverthorne and Mason and their gang of cutthroats couldn't make me give it up. There's only one person could have made me do that. She'd only have to say that she don't think as much of me as I think she ought to, and then—" "She'll keep pretty silent about that, I think," interrupted Owen, grinning at the girl's crimson face. "I wouldn't be taking your word for it," grinned Sanderson. "It wouldn't be reliable." "Why—" began Mary, and looked at Owen. "Sure," he laughed. "I'll go and take a walk. There are times when three can't explain a thing as well as two." There was a silence following Owen's departure. Then Mary looked shyly at Sanderson, who was watching her with a smile. "Does it need any explaining?" she began. "Can't you see that—" "Shucks, little girl," he said gently as he leaned toward her. "Words ain't—words ain't so awful important, are they?" Apparently words were not important, for within the next few minutes there were few spoken, and progress was made without them. And then, "I believe I never was so happy as when I saw you, that morning, coming into Okar with Dale's body, and you said you had not killed him. And if Will, had killed him that day, if he had really hanged him, and Dale had died from it, I should have kept seeing Dale as he was hanging there all my life." "It was Dale's day," said Sanderson. "And Okar's," declared the girl. "The town has taken on a new spirit since those men have left, and the whole basin has changed. Men are more interested and eager. There is an atmosphere of fellowship that was absent before. And, oh, Deal, how happy I am." "You ain't got anything on me," grinned Sanderson. And presently, looking toward the rim of the mesa, they saw Williams and his men coming toward them from Lizette with many wagons loaded with supplies and material for the new dam, forecasting a new day and a new prosperity for the AA and themselves. "That's for a new deal," said Sanderson, watching the wagons and men. "Wrong," she laughed happily. "It is all for a square deal." "All?" he returned, grinning at her. "All," she repeated, snuggling close to him. End of chapter 35. Read by Tom Penn. End of Square Deal Sanderson by Charles Alden Seltzer.